and I'm going to turn it over to Veronica.
All right, thank you so much, Shannon, and thank you all for being here. As was mentioned, I'm Veronica Yurchak. So I'm the extension specialist with University of Maryland, focusing on commercial vegetable production and IPM. And today we're going to be talking about tomatoes. So I just want to mention I mostly targeted this overview kind of towards growers looking to start out growing tomatoes on a little bit of a commercial scale, so something like a market garden or for a farmer's market. But a lot of these recommendations could be scaled up or down to fit your situation. So today's presentation can kind of be broken down into two parts. So the first is going to go through kind of the nuts and bolts of growing tomatoes, things like variety selection, seed starting, trellising, that kind of thing. And then the second part will get into some troubleshooting. So go through some of the more common challenges or issues that arise when growing tomatoes. So jumping right into variety selection, of course, when you're choosing variety, you're going to consider things like the type of tomato, so whether it's a slicing tomato or a cherry tomato, aroma tomato, and you're going to pick ones that you think for whatever reason or characteristics that are described for that variety will taste good, and are visually appealing. But there's some differences that we need to understand, and some terminology associated with the different types of varieties. So understanding whether it's an indeterminate or a determinate variety, and then whether it's a hybrid or an heirloom. So indeterminate varieties, which includes many of the heirloom varieties and a lot of the cherry tomatoes, these are going to be vining, continuously growing plants. So they just continue to grow up. They get very tall and they produce flowers and fruit continuously until they are killed by frost. And so because they get so big, they require a significant amount of trellising and pruning to kind of maintain those plants the best that they can be. Determinate varieties, on the other hand, are going to grow to a pretty specific predetermined height. So this will fluctuate a little bit based on the amount of sunlight that they get and your fertility. But they set flowers and fruit over a much shorter time frame. So you'll have a much more concentrated harvest period. So if you want to grow a determinate variety and harvest throughout the season, you have to have sequential plantings, so that you can have multiple harvest periods. And these plants are a lot more compact and bushy, so they require a lot less in the way of trellising and pruning. Pretty much all tomatoes need some kind of support, and so we'll talk about that. But the determinate ones are a lot smaller and easier when it comes to the trellising and pruning that you're supposed to do. Hybrid varieties, so these are ones that are intentionally bred for specific traits. So tomato breeders and seed companies will cross-pollinate two varieties, two different parent varieties to combine the best traits. So these are usually things like higher yields or resistance to certain diseases. Because they are intentionally cross-pollinated and the way that that process happens, you cannot save seed from hybrid varieties and grow the same plant out. So you can save seed from a hybrid variety and it typically will germinate, but you most likely will not get a plant that's and tomato fruits that are anything like the plant that you saved the seed from. So saving seed results in a very unpredictable outcome. Whereas heirloom varieties, these are varieties that are grown from seeds that have been passed down through generations. So of course you can save seed from heirloom varieties and replant. Heirlooms are known for their diversity of colors, shapes, flavors. People really like heirloom varieties. They're a lot harder to grow than hybrid varieties because they haven't been bred to have that disease tolerance that a lot of the hybrid varieties have. Um, so yeah, they taste very good, and they're very pretty, but they're a lot more difficult to grow. And as a result, or as kind of a way to get around that, some people will use grafted varieties. So grafted tomatoes or grafted plants are when you combine the above ground portion of one plant with the below ground portion of another plant. So you essentially slice the stem and put the above ground part, the scion of a disease-prone heirloom on top, and attach it to a vigorous disease-resistant rootstock. And so this gives you protection from a lot of soil-borne diseases. And even in the absence of a lot of those diseases, grafted varieties tend to be a lot more vigorous and have higher yields. They are also quite a bit more expensive than just buying a non-grafted transplant or tomato seeds. Penn State has a really good write-up on grafted tomatoes. So there's a lot of information there on when it makes sense to go with grafted varieties. And there's also a really good table of all the different options when you're looking online to or in a store to purchase grafted varieties or to order them. All the different rootstocks and the names of or the diseases that you get tolerance to with that rootstock. I will mention grafted tomatoes are typically used if you are growing in a high tunnel rather than out in the field. There's nothing wrong with using grafted varieties in the field, but in a high tunnel where you're typically growing tomatoes or the same crop year after year in the same spot, this is where we see a lot of buildup of those soil pathogens that the grafted varieties are tolerant to. Whereas in the field, you can just rotate to a new area and it kind of makes less sense to buy these more expensive transplants. But again, it can be done. It's just more common in high tunnels. When it comes to just choosing varieties that grow well here in the Mid-Atlantic region, we have a guide that's available online. It's called the Mid-Atlantic Commercial Vegetable Production Recommendations Guide. There's a new version put out every 2 years. And the beginning of each chapter has variety recommendations. So there's different chapters for each vegetable crop, and there's a table in the beginning of each chapter that gives you a list of varieties that we know grow well in our area. I will mention a couple things about the guide. So it is intended for commercial growers. So there's going to be some information in there that may not be as relevant if you're growing just sort of for a home garden. But a lot of the information, even though it's designed for commercial growers, it's still applicable, right? So the varieties that grow well in our area are going to grow well, whether it's a few plants in your garden or a large field of that tomato. Plant spacing is still relevant. The fertility recommendations are still going to be relevant. So there's a lot of good information in this guide. The variety recommendations for some crops do need to be updated. So seed companies come out with new varieties a lot faster than we are able to do the trials to test them. So just because something isn't listed in there doesn't mean we found it performs poorly. It just means that we might not have tested it yet. But those that are included, we do know grow well. There's a lot of information with insecticide and pesticide recommendations. That is more, again, designed for commercial operations and also has a lot more information for non-organic producers. And this is available for free online, or if you want to, you can purchase it as a printed copy. But just search the title and it'll come up through Maryland, Virginia, New Jersey, Pennsylvania extension. So it should be pretty easy to find. Jumping into seed starting for tomatoes. So the number one mistake that I see people make when it comes to starting tomato seeds, especially when growing kind of on a smaller scale, is starting seeds too early. So I'm guilty of it too, right? We get past the holidays and everybody's kind of antsy for spring, and you just decide to start and it's too early. And then these transplants are ready to go in the field, but the conditions aren't right outside. So for regular season outdoor production, starting seeds around the first week of April is a pretty good time. That's usually when I start mine for my trials. Starting seeds sooner just means you have to have some kind of plan in place for protecting them from cold temperatures once they're out in the field, because they're probably going to experience temperatures that are not optimal for growth and development. So tomato seeds germinate best around 75 to 85 degrees. So that means you're going to need a heat mat or something, some kind of heated surface to keep those trays on so that they germinate properly. And tomato seeds do not like to be planted very deep, so only about a quarter of an inch. Otherwise, you have issues with germination. And then make sure to use grow lights, usually about 14 to 16 hours per day for germination and small seedlings to prevent them from getting kind of leggy and stretched out and falling over before they go out in the field. When preparing kind of where you're going to put your tomatoes, keep in mind that they require full sun. So that's at least 6 hours of direct sunlight a day. More is better. So if they can be in the sun for the full length of the day, that's good. If they are going to get some time of the day that they're in the shade, morning sun is a lot better than afternoon sun. Um, so if you can put them in a spot where they're going to get morning sun, that's going to be important. Afternoon sun tends to be a lot harsher and more intense, and they do well with a little bit of protection from afternoon sun. Performing a soil test, especially if you're going to be trying to grow tomatoes on more of a commercial scale, again, for a market garden or a farmer's market or something like that. This helps to determine your nutrient levels, what your soil pH is, which strongly affects the plant's ability to take up different nutrients. So tomatoes want a pH of around 6 to 6.5, and they grow best in medium textured, soft, well-drained soil. They can still grow in sandy soils or heavy clay soils, but you may need to make some improvements with different compost or other amendments to make that soil more compatible for tomato production. When it is time to transplant your tomato seedlings, if these are tomato seedlings that you purchased, this may not be as important, but if they are seedlings that you started inside yourself, they need to be hardened off before transplanting, which just means they need a little bit of time to get used to kind of a semi-field environment before being put straight into the outdoor environment. So usually putting them in a protected, sort of shaded outdoor area for about a week where they can just become used to things like wind and direct sunlight, so shaded but not fully shaded all day, things like that, and where they can become a little more used to fluctuations in temperature, since likely where they were prior to this point was a very consistent temperature, predictable environment. Um, you don't want to plant transplant tomato transplants until after the danger of the last frost has passed. So that is becoming more difficult to predict when that's going to be. But you want nighttime temperatures to consistently be above 50 degrees. Um, so again, that's why starting your seeds usually around the first week of April, will get you transplants that are ready to go once the conditions are right in the field. You can plant tomato seedlings really deep when you put them out. So this encourages more root development. Really, you can bury them almost up to that first set of true leaves, and that whole stem will start putting out roots, and just give you kind of a more vigorous plant. And you can avoid transplant shock by planting on a cool, cloudy day or later in the afternoon. They'll probably be fine if you plant them earlier on a hot day. I know I've done it for field studies, but they may take more time to really start growing again in the field, if you transplant them out during harsher weather conditions. So moving on to trellising, I'm going to talk about kind of the easiest, most straightforward method. So everybody has different ways that they like to stake or trellis tomatoes. Depending on the scale that you're working on, there are a lot of different ways that are perfectly acceptable and perfectly fine. I'm just going to cover the way that kind of lets you trellis the most plants as quickly as possible. Um, and so this is by using wood, fiberglass, or steel-coated stakes that you place about every 2 to 3 plants down your row of tomatoes. Some people do every plant, but you can get away with spreading it out to more like every 2 or 3 plants. You want to pound those stakes in about 6 to 12 inches into the soil, just so they're kind of sturdy. And then for most determinate varieties, 60-inch stakes are going to be adequate. Some varieties, like Roma tomatoes, are smaller, so you can get away with maybe a 4-foot stake instead of a 5-foot one. And then the determinate varieties, usually, if they're grown in the field, need tall 7, 8 foot T-posts, because again, they get very tall. And then for stringing the tomatoes, the simplest thing when you have this kind of stake and tie method is to just run your string along, tie it to one post, run it along one side of the plant, wrap the next post, and move along till you've done the whole length of your tomato row, and then kind of wrap it again around the post and head back the other direction. So you want to string the plants as tightly as you can when they're young so that they are, well supported. When the plants get taller and you're stringing kind of the bushier part of the plants up higher, that should be looser. So it still has to be tight enough that the plants are supported, but if you string the upper part of the plants too tightly, you can't really get in there to harvest those tomatoes. And you also may start to see misshapen fruit because the canopy is not open enough for that fruit to grow and develop. Um, just some other comments. So the stringing should be done when the plants are dry to prevent the spread of diseases. So a lot of bacterial diseases, especially, you can move very easily through the plant with that string. So just keep that in mind. When it comes to pruning determinate varieties, just kind of a quick disclaimer before I get into this. As with the trellising, everyone seems to have their own way of pruning tomatoes, and even different extension outlets from different universities have varying recommendations. So I'm just going to share how I prune my tomatoes, which has worked well for me in the past and produced very nice tomatoes over the years. So all tomatoes produce what's called a sucker above every branch. So you can see that in the picture here. You basically have the axis where the branch is coming out from the main stem, and then the sucker is that additional kind of branch that's growing out at an angle there. If you leave the plant completely unpruned, each sucker will grow into a shoot that has leaves and fruit. And so if you leave all of those suckers on, all the leaves and fruit are competing with each other for food, light, and water. So by limiting the number of suckers, it leaves the and leaves on the plant, the energy is directed to kind of the remaining shoots. So you get larger, nicer tomatoes than if you just leave everything on the plant. So in my trials for determinate varieties, I don't know if you'll see my pointer here, but I remove the suckers from all of the branches below the first flower cluster, except the one immediately below the first flowers. So wherever those first flowers come out from on the plant, that first sucker below it, I'll leave. And then the rest of them below that, I will remove. So again, this helps direct the energy towards the fruit and the leaves that will develop on the upper part of the plant. And it also kind of opens up that lower part of the plant canopy, which helps with air movement through the plant and helps reduce your foliar diseases, a lot of which will start in the lower area of the plant. So that's how I prune tomatoes. For indeterminate varieties, in a high tunnel, it's very different. So again, indeterminate varieties in the field, you just need taller stakes and you can do pretty much the same thing. But if you do happen to be growing them in a high tunnel, then the indeterminate varieties require some kind of vertical support system. So it usually looks like a string or some kind of twine hanging from the ceiling and anchored into the soil on the floor. And then when you prune, you have to decide on what's called liters. So either 1 or 2 liters per plant. And so you can see the pictures here. A single liter is essentially one vine that grows up that support system. And so a lot of hybrid varieties do well as a single liter. And then a 2 liter plant is when you essentially have two vines growing up from a single stem at the base. And this is typically used for grafted plants or some heirloom varieties. And so basically, how you do this is you attach the plant at the base with either a clip, or some kind of tie, and then you add clips every 6 to 12 inches as the plant gets taller. Um, So this is just a picture here where you can see that in a high tunnel here. You can see these clips every 6 to 12 inches, kind of holding that plant against that vertical trellis system. And to prune the plant to have this sort of growth habit, you essentially, for a single liter system, you remove all of the suckers. So throughout the entire plant growth, you remove all the suckers. For a 2 liter plant, you remove all the suckers except the one just below the first flower cluster. And then you get that second one will grow into a second liter, and then you remove all the other suckers. Um, and so again, this is for a high tunnel system. If that vertical support, so that string is loose enough, so this takes some trial and error, you can actually just wrap the plant or the vine as it grows up and it can support itself that way. So I have kind of a cool video that I found online showing that along with the pruning. So you can see here they're wrapping the plant up that vertical support system. And then he's going to come in and start cutting out the suckers that are growing. So this is a single liter system. And so you can see they're cutting out all the suckers there and wrapping that plant as it gets taller. And so unlike with the determinate varieties, all the way up to the newest growth, you remove those suckers. Um, and then I didn't actually intend there to be sound, but that's okay. And then you can see cutting off all the lower leaves. I just want to skip to the end of the video. You can see basically the lower portion of the plant is just a stem, and this allows for airflow through the high tunnel and really cuts down on diseases. So moving on to tomato fertility. Again, I mentioned it's really important to have that soil test if you can early in the season. And so you'll use that to kind of figure out what nutrients your soil is deficient in, with the exception of nitrogen. So nitrogen is one that's not that, it fluctuates a lot during the season. So the time that you performed a soil test may not really give you a lot of good information about the nitrogen levels in the soil throughout the season. Um, so nitrogen is applied just on a schedule, and you can get that information in the recommendations guide as far as how much nitrogen should be applied and when for tomatoes. Keep in mind that applying too many nutrients is detrimental both to the plant and the environment. So you don't just want to keep feeding fertilizer without really having any kind of an idea of how much you're giving the plant or how much it needs. In general, for tomatoes, fertilizers with added calcium can help to reduce the likelihood of something called blossom end rot, which you can see in the picture here. I'll talk a little more about that later, but for my tomatoes, when I do fertilize with a nitrogen fertilizer, I do pick one that has a little bit of added calcium. Tomatoes use a lot of calcium. And then for irrigation, you just want to make sure to water deeply, not necessarily frequently. So making sure the water is really getting down deep, encouraging deep root growth on those plants. Overall, drip irrigation of some kind is going to be your best option for delivering water slowly to the root zone. So This cuts down on foliar diseases because you're not getting that whole plant canopy wet every time you water. And it also, you use less water since you don't have nearly as much evaporating off of the plant. In general, tomatoes need 1 to 2 inches of water a week. Um, and applying it just to the soil area also reduces cracking, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. So that kind of wraps up my nuts and bolts of tomato production. And then I just want to quickly go through a little bit of the most common uh, issues or challenges you might run into. So first, the insect pests. I really just want to point out the main ones you might see. So tomatoes get a lot of caterpillar pests. Two of the most common are hornworms, which you see on the left, and then tomato fruitworms, which is in the picture on the right there. For pretty much all the caterpillar pests that tomatoes get, if you find them when they're small, BT sprays can be very effective at controlling them. And then that recommendations guide will have some options for you for later in the season. I also want to point out, so this hornworm, as you can see, it has all these little white things on the outside of its body. These are parasitoid wasp pupa. So while the hornworm is damaging to your tomato plants, if you see one that looks like this, it's better to just leave it because all of those individual white pupa cases will hatch out into a new parasitoid wasp that will go on to attack more of the hornworms in that planting. So if you see that, that's a good thing. It looks strange, but it's just kind of biocontrol at work. Another pest that's really common is thrips. So you can see what that looks like in this picture here, but they are extremely tiny, so they're very difficult to see the actual insect on the plant. The foliar damage that they cause, you can see here, kind of this white discoloration and stippling marks, and then they cause this kind of gold flecking on the fruit. If you have high enough numbers of thrips in your tomatoes, you can get enough direct feeding damage to damage the plant or the marketability of the fruit. But the main sort of concern with thrips is that they are the vector for tomato spotted wilt virus. So this picture on the bottom here shows a tomato fruit with tomato spotted wilt virus. So you get kind of these ring looking spots all over the fruit. The virus itself can cause a whole range of symptoms, but if the plant is infected early enough, it will be stunted and produce very low yields, if any, and kind of deformed, not nice looking tomatoes. So the threshold for thrips in tomatoes is very low if you are growing a susceptible variety. So that's another thing you can look at in that recommendations guide is some of the varieties are resistant to tomato spotted wilt virus, meaning that if an infected thrips feeds on that variety, even if they have, even if they have the disease in them, they will not be able to transmit the disease to the plant and get symptomatic plants. The only other thing I should mention is that if the thrips infestation is high enough, you can still see some of these symptoms in the fruit, even in a tolerant variety, because that tolerance or that resistance isn't as strong in the fruit itself. So just something to keep in mind, but you need really, really high thrips pressure for that to happen. And then finally, stink bugs. They're a very common insect pest. This is kind of the damage they cause if you see this in your tomatoes. So it's sort of like a deeper damage than the thrips damage, and it makes kind of like a white spongy area underneath the skin from the stink bug feeding. Here in Maryland, the most common stink bugs you'll find in tomatoes are these top two here, but we do have some green stink bugs that can damage tomatoes as well. So quickly moving on to abiotic disorders, which are just kind of non-living physiological responses that the plant has either to unfavorable environmental conditions or poor cultural practices or nutrient imbalances. So cat facing is when you see tomatoes that look like this. It's more common on the earlier fruits. So kind of those first ones that you pick off of a tomato plant. And this is caused by chilly temperatures during flowering. So if you get temperatures much below 54 degrees at the time that the fruit or that the tomato plant has flowers on it, it can kill the specific cells that should have turned into that tomato fruit. So you end up with these kind of deformed, hard brown areas that never developed into that fruit. So some other causes can be extreme day and night temperature fluctuations. So between the two of those, I'm expecting to see quite a bit of cat facing in my tomatoes this year, just because we have had such late cold weather, and then periodic very hot weather this spring. And occasionally 2,4-D damage at the right time can cause this as well. Cracking. So this is caused when the skin of the fruit doesn't expand at the same rate as the interior of the fruit. So it's caused by a rapid uptake of water. So the plant takes up too much water, the fruit's trying to expand, but the skin can't keep up and it cracks. Um, and so it's most common, of course, after heavy rain events, but it can occur with irregular irrigation as well. And the severity is really going to be determined by, of course, how much water it takes up, but then also the variety and the maturity. So riper fruit is more likely to crack. So a reason why a lot of growers will harvest early if rain is predicted, because those tomatoes will ripen off the plant and then they won't crack. Russeting or rain check. So this is when you see these kind of numerous concentric sort of micro cracks around the top of the fruit, especially on the shoulder area. They feel kind of rough and leathery. And this is caused by having water present on the fruit for an extended period of time. And so it can occur after a rain event or also if we have a lot of heavy dews in the morning. So this one tends to be more common later in the season, once we start to have cooler nights again and heavier dews. But maintaining good foliage cover through proper fertilization and then using fungicides if you have any foliar diseases to prevent leaf drop, can help to reduce this russeting, because you will have less water sitting on the surface of the fruit when it's protected. And then I think the last one I want to talk about is just the ripening disorders. So these are caused by nutrient imbalances, and two common ones caused by potassium deficiency are this internal whitening in the top photo, and then this what's called yellow shoulder, which you can see in the bottom photo, where that yellow area around the shoulder of the fruit never ripens. Um, so again, this is caused by insufficient potassium getting to the fruit. That is typically the insufficient nutrient is typically a result of insufficient watering or very high temperatures. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But the other one I want to mention before I get into that is blossom end rot, which is very similar, but it's caused by a calcium deficiency instead of potassium. But again, it's when the fruit isn't getting enough of that nutrient. And calcium and potassium are both nutrients that move through the plant with water. So basically, they're in the soil, the plant takes up that water, and the way the water moves through the plant is that the leaves have these small openings that allow water to evaporate out. And when the water evaporates out, it essentially forms kind of like a suction or a negative pressure. And so the water moves up through the roots and is pulled out through the surface of the leaves. When there is, of course, not enough soil moisture, the plant can't take up that water. But when we have very high temperatures in the summer, where the plant becomes heat stressed, they close those openings on the leaves so that they're not taking up, they're not losing water, but they're also not taking up water. So while they may not necessarily look wilted, they're not transporting that water through the plant and taking up more nutrients. And as a result of that, you end up not getting enough nutrients to the fruit and you see these disorders. So as much as possible, just keeping them well watered and protected from extreme conditions as much as possible. So very difficult to do in a field setting. I have some research where I'm starting to look at using shade cloth to try to uh, avoid some of these issues, but that's very early on, so I wouldn't recommend that yet. Um, but moving on to diseases, I am not a plant pathologist, so the best thing that I can do if you see diseases in your tomatoes, is reach out to those who do know more about plant diseases. So if you have a backyard garden, the Home and Garden Information Center with the University of Maryland Extension has a portion of their website with it's called Ask Extension, and you can submit photos or a description of the issue that you're having, and they will get back to you with some recommendations or some information about what they think is going on. If you are a commercial grower, you can reach out to me or in either case to your county extension agent, and they can help you submit samples to our plant diagnostic lab where they can run tests and officially determine what pathogen you're dealing with and help give some recommendations about how to manage that disease or that pathogen. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions, if anybody has any, or I think as Shannon mentioned, these slides will be available to you. Um, and so you can go back and clarify anything that way as well. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. And if not, you also can reach out to my email. It's there. I didn't put my phone number because we're getting a new phone number soon, and so I didn't want to put that, but email is a great way to reach out if you have any questions as well.